Phil Brochard, and in this video, we're going to explore self-differentiated leadership. And as part of it, we'll look at some of the basic forces of human connection and relationship, the forces of connection and distance or differentiation. We'll look at some of the work that Bowen and Edwin Friedman have done and explore what it's like to think of the self and the system, and ways to approach how you consider relationships through either lens. And then we're going to look at this really helpful model that looks at three ways that self-differentiated leadership is engaged in the course of a congregation or a family or a business or a country, anywhere that human beings get together at some point for some reason. Pretty broad, us humans. All right, so I'm going to do this by trying to share the screen and use some of the College for Congregational Development materials. Here we go. So we're going to start with this first definition of a self-differentiated leader. You'll see that it comes from Edwin Friedman right here. He was a therapist, he was a rabbi, a scholar, an author. This is actually from his last book, one that he wrote at the end of his life called A Failure of Nerve. And so we're just gonna pay attention to some of these words particularly. A definition of a self-differentiated leader is someone who is less likely to become lost in the emotional processes swirling about. If you've ever been in a really challenging situation, a conflictual situation, or something that was really uncertain, this swirling is a really evocative word that I think is really helpful, because things feel like they're outside of your control, and the stress level rises, and you make sometimes quick or rash decisions because of this. So the definition of a self-differentiated leader is someone who can separate while remaining connected. And we're going to talk about this more and more as we go through this concept. And so when you do this, you can remain a modifying, non-anxious, and sometimes challenging presence. Just a word about non-anxious and challenging. Oftentimes when we talk about non-anxious leadership, and when we talk about it, at least in the Episcopal Church, often we're drawing on the work of Edwin Friedman and others. And sometimes we use non-anxious as if the waters were never going to ripple. And that's not actually what Friedman is talking about. When you're non-anxious, it means that you are able to, as he talks about in the next phrase, manage your own reactivity. You still sometimes need to bring challenge. That is part of the work in a system. But if you can manage your own reactivity vis-a-vis the people around you, then your anxiety does not spread to the system. And so therefore, you're able to take stands at the risk of displeasing, which is one of the core jobs of any leader, is to be able to do that. And he says, it is not as though some leaders can do this and some cannot. No one does this easily, and most leaders I have learned can improve their capacity. So I find these to be really helpful words, really hopeful words, because whenever I have difficulty being self-differentiated as a leader, I can remember, right, this doesn't come easily. This is challenging for everybody. And over the course of my life and my work, I can continue to improve my capacity. Later in that book, Failure of Nerve, one of the things that Friedman says is he thinks that maybe the best we can do is around 80% of the time being self-differentiated. So there are always moments where we are going to react or disconnect in ways that are not totally helpful. Okay, so that is the definition we're going to be working with. Let's now take a look at what we mean by systems thinking and separate parts thinking. So systems thinking is basically an approach to life, organizations, that sees everything as interrelated. And so often when we consider how, like when there's a problem, when someone has challenged us or other parts of a system, we are often putting ourselves into this left category of separate parts thinking. And now this is the work of Peter Steinke, who in his book, Healthy Congregations, A Systems Approach, has taken a lot of the work of Murray Bowen and Ed Friedman and put it into this chart here. And so I'm not going to go through it in great detail just because there's a lot of information, but what I want you to consider is that when a problem comes up, it's not just one person's issue or fault. It actually is something that belongs to the whole group, right? And so the problem or the issue is something that the whole group needs to engage, and everybody in the group in some way is affected by it, right? So you can't just like take care of that individual and assume that everything will then be rectified. One of the things that Bowen learned early on was that as he was engaging in therapy in the 1950s and onward, was that when we tried to treat individuals that were having challenges and sent them back into a family system, that if we also didn't do work with the system itself, the individual didn't really stand much of a chance. So a few more things to gain from separate parts thinking versus systems thinking. In separate parts, the whole can be understood by reduction into the parts, whereas in systems thinking, it's the interaction between those parts that helps you understand the wholeness of it. Again, in separate parts thinking, understanding comes from breaking down the whole into smaller and smaller pieces. Systems thinking says, all right, let's look up and look bigger and bigger and bigger to get an understanding of how this is working. Parts can be understood in and by themselves, and the mutual influence is what you pay attention to in systems thinking. And then in separate parts thinking, you look and think in lines A to B, whereas in systems thinking, you're thinking about loops, right? You come, you get your more information, you come back to where the issue was, and you come back again. So those are some of the just basic understandings of why in systems thinking, this is about that bigger picture and in the interrelation between the parts, as opposed to just the individual or the smaller parts that are part of the system. You're going to use both ways of thinking in the work that you do in a congregation as a leader. I think that the work of Friedman and Bowen and others would say that the separate parts thinking predominates most of the time, and we have to be able to think in a systemic way as well. So then looking further down, this is one of the more interesting parts, I think, to this teaching. And as I was preparing to put this teaching together, I realized I need to put this part right here on my wall. This just needs to be a part of what I see every day. And here's why. The leader's position is actually a really important one in a system, according to this theory. And it's not just because this is, say, where the authority rests because of the way the system is constructed or the title that's been given, but also because the leader has the ability to be an invisible force of influence, right? An invisible force of influence. And so as such, the leader can have a profound effect and certainly an outsized effect, and there's tremendous potential. And so here's some ways that we can see this. So when a system is in crisis, the leader can bring calm. Okay, so when things are chaotic and where people aren't sure what's going to happen next, when things are really uncertain, one of the things the leader can do in the system, and this is by both their words and actions and their presence, the leader can bring calm. When the system is bewildered, is not sure where to turn to next, the leader can bring focus. Okay, so this is saying to the system, hey, Let's pay attention here. This is probably the most important thing in this moment. When the system is stagnant, the leader can bring challenge. Okay, if things are not moving, if change is not taking place, if things are just slow and sclerotic, the leader can bring some challenge, some energy to the system. And then, when new situations arise that need new responses, the leader can bring change. Similar to a system that is stuck in stasis, this is when you realize, the system realizes something new needs to happen. The leader can bring or lead into change. Okay, so again, I'd say write that down, put it up on your wall, bathroom mirror, whatever, because when you're in these situations, sometimes it can be hard to know what to do next, and this can help give you an idea where to give your attention. The next part here is about chronic anxiety. And so anxiety, actually, in the world of systems theory, is actually a neutral force, right? Anxiety can be something that is used to help a system, and also can be used to inhibit a system. And I realize it sometimes gets lost because we talk about a non-anxious presence, which kind of casts anxiety in a somewhat negative light. But that's not the purpose here, because anxiety is the energy that takes place that allows you, or sometimes compels you, to change. Without anxiety, we would never move. Nothing would ever shift. We would have no reason to do anything else. The challenge, though, is when anxiety becomes chronic, right? One of the ways that we recognize this, as I'm patting my chest here, is in our bodies. Our bodies work with anxiety in ways that can be really helpful, like fight or flight or something like that. But if we're constantly in a state of anxiety, it can actually debilitate and really make it difficult for us to engage thoughtfully and well in whatever is in front of us. And so this was something that Bowen also talked about here in regards to, he used this term with emotional reactivity, right? So chronic anxiety and emotional reactivity are linked. And so that rather than being able to take some space and really kind of own where your feelings are, in a place of chronic anxiety and emotional reactivity, you're just, when somebody else has a powerful feeling, you go to where they are, or you push against where they are. But either way, you're not able to engage where you actually are in that moment. Okay, let's now then take a look at the basic life forces. I talked a little bit at the start of this about this understanding, and this theory says that there are two basic opposing life forces. And this is critical to the understanding of the self, right? And one of the life forces is towards togetherness, right? Let's see if I can get that there. So the togetherness force is about the pressure and desire to be like other people, right? And you want to agree on principles, values, feelings. You and the group around you want to be really homogeneous, let's go with that, and be together in what you're facing. That is opposed to the individuality force, or also what's called the differentiating force. And this is the desire to be separate from others around you. Now, what's really important here is that there's, again, neither good nor bad. Both are essential to a healthy self-differentiation. But the force of togetherness or connection is the one that says, yes, I am with you. And the differentiating or individuality force is, I am also myself. And so the differentiating force then is responsible for the self being the self without making demands on others or blaming others. So if I'm doing the differentiating well, even though I may have a different thought or opinion or way of being, I can still be in relationship with you and not force you to be like me. You can be you, and I can be me, and we can still be in relationship together. Okay, so those are the two basic forces, and I think you're going to see those at play in the rest of the material we look at here. So last thing here, which is that one of the teachings of Bowen and others is that the basic building blocks of the self are inborn, and an individual's family relationships during childhood and adolescence determine how much self he or she develops. I think the short answer here is that your family of origin does have an effect on who you are. And so the more that we're able to understand that and work with that, differentiate from it, integrate it, the more we're going to be able to do the work as leaders in the places that we are being asked to lead. At this point, what I think I'm going to do is take all this theory and bring it into an experience that I have been engaged in recently. And so we're recording this in the month of June in 2020. The last several months have been just incredibly intense, stressful months. Between the pandemic of COVID-19 that has emerged, and then the cataclysmic economic effects of sheltering in place, and then the death of George Floyd, and the upwelling of rage and hope and anger and a desire to change in this country. All of that has been coming to bear in the last several months. And so it's been a really, really challenging, stressful time to be a leader, any kind of a leader, a parent, a manager, a priest, a president, all really stressful. And so one of the ways that this is working out in the place where I serve at All Souls in Berkeley, and this is just a small instance just to give you a picture of this. Some of our folks, let's see here if I can go back to a screen share. There we go. Some of our folks who are young parents who are trying to either work from home and or have had hours dropped and or looking for work are also trying to raise young children. And so a couple of them had found that our Sunday worship at 10:30 is just not the right time for them. And so they came to us and said, this isn't working for me or for us. What we really need to have is a service on Sundays at 7 a.m. And there are a couple of ways that we could have responded, or maybe even before responding, we could have reacted to this idea. And one is we could have said, well, this is a problem of just that person. Oh gosh, well, this is just what they're dealing with and they're just going to have to deal with it. The reverse of that, we could have also had said, oh my goodness, well, we need to do whatever that person says. And so we decided to do something different than either of those options, which is we were planning on doing a survey. And so what we have said was, you know what, that sounds really hard. Let's find out how other parents of young children and other parishioners are feeling. Let's find out if we can see where this issue lies, right? Because the problem doesn't just belong to the person, the problem belongs also to the system. And by system, I don't just mean All Souls where I serve. There are interlocking or overlapping systems that we're all a part of that we have no control over, and yet they exert influence on us and our systems. So the economic system, our county health department, all these are systems that affect the people of our congregations and are going to increase and or help ground the stressing that is around us. The other thing that we're trying to do is look to the whole to explain some of the parts of how this works out. Understanding that what we're trying to do is look up, right? Get bigger and bigger and bigger in terms of our perspective so that we can understand the way the pieces are influencing each other. Lastly, hopefully when we collect all this information, we're going to be able to take a look at it, sort through it, parse it out, find out what's helpful to see, what patterns there might be, what outliers they might be, and then we're going to feed it back to the whole congregation so that the whole congregation has a chance to get this perspective from 30,000 feet, say, or maybe even 10,000 feet, because we're not going to get the biggest perspective for years from now. But when we've done that, hopefully we will be thinking in loops, right? And so the work that we've done hopefully will come back to those families that have young children and say, hey, here's what we found. What do you think? How do you feel about this? And it may be that they still have a desire for a 7 a.m. morning prayer service, but hopefully we'll all have more information about how all these parts are working one with another. So that is just one way into this. And now you'll see in this section, and I encourage you to take some time to read this. This is a section that talks a little bit about triangles, what we have understood as the basic molecule of human relationship systems. You can do some more reading there, and I encourage that. At this point, though, we're going to move to this model that I think can be really helpful. And let's move right here. So again, this is all under the understanding that the stance that we are trying to hold as much as we can, and we always have room to improve our capacity, is a stance of self-regulated, non-reactive, non-anxious presence. And so here are ways to engage this. Well, in the case of a leader, one of the things that you can do is you can set a direction. You remember earlier when the theory teaches us that if there's bewilderment, a leader can bring focus. Well, setting direction is one way to bring focus to a situation. You're trying to help people see where this place can go next. It's one of the things that Martin Luther King was doing in the "I Have a Dream" speech. He was setting a direction for our nation. In fact, Ed Friedman, who did a lot of consulting with congregations of all kinds of faiths, one of the things he would say to the leader of a congregation, if they were feeling really stuck or if there was a lot of reactivity, one of the things he would say was, what's your "I have a dream" speech? What kind of direction does this place need set from its leader? So you set direction, hopefully through prayer and conversation and understanding and contemplation, and you come to that place and you say, this is where we're headed. Well, it may not be that the whole congregation is ready to jump on board right away. And so often what happens next is resistance, sometimes even sabotage. And resistance in and of itself, I think, is just a natural response of any system. Because if systems were always changing every day, there would be no stability to be able to draw on, to be able to flourish with. But when you are in a system, you have to expect that there will be some resistance. This is a natural thing. And so what you can do is you can manage it. It doesn't have to be something that you try and push away. It's something you can expect and something that in some ways you can kind of lean into as you're differentiated, right? Because, for instance, sabotage is something that even when we expect it, it still hurts. But doing what we can to be not react to it and to regulate our own emotions so that knowing that it's happening, we're able to still move forward. I can't help but thinking about Jesus at the table with the disciples, right? The last night he's with them, knowing the sabotage that was going to come from Judas, experiencing it, whether it's at the table or in the garden, and being able to somehow love and continue on. Which brings us to this third part, staying connected. Because one of the things that I find is an easy place to go as a leader is after I have set a direction, or we have set a direction as a leadership body, and I feel this sabotage coming to me or this resistance, one of the ways I will often go is to differentiate. And that can be okay, but you cannot distance yourself from the system and the people in the system entirely. In fact, one of the most powerful things you can do in that moment is to stay connected, to build those relationships, to rebuild those relationships, to have those really hard conversations that are conversations of vulnerability. Because when you can do that, then the system will recognize its leader in a way that it will hopefully be able to hold on to and hear what the next setting of direction might be. Just a few words, which is that you can see I went in this direction from setting a direction to managing resistance to staying connected, as if this were simply a linear process, which it's not, right? All this is so interconnected that it may be through the process of staying connected that you're actually engaging in the managing of resistance. And maybe before you're about to set direction, you start thinking, okay, so who do I need to be connected with now? Who's going to most be impacted by this so that I can, at the very least, hear where they are and have that in mind? Again, I still may be where I am, but I'm going to be connected to another person to be able to take in either their frustration, their pain, their hope, their joy for what we might be doing next. All to say that these arrows point around, and it's a dynamic process. So here you'll see just a little bit more about how this happens. Again, just to articulate one more time that staying connected to others is resisting the impulse to cut oneself off physically and emotionally, right? That is different from differentiation, right? Differentiation is not cutting oneself off. You're still in relationship. Even if that person doesn't agree with you, that's okay. You're still going to hold on to the relationship and listen to people. Then, setting direction, taking that clearly conceived and defined position that will create, where appropriate, the movement of the system to greater health, faithfulness, and effectiveness. That's what we're aiming to do. To be an I in the pressure to blend into the we, knowing one's own opinion, stance, and without imposing that on others, and that they have to have the same stance that you do. Lastly, without retribution, rigidity, dogmatism, cutoff, withdrawal, stay the course in the face of the human tendency to resist. So that is a fair number of ideas, words, all in this system. And so I just want to, we've talked about these three big ideas of setting direction, managing resistance, staying connected. And remember this high level thought as a leader, which is that when you're facing, when you're unclear as to kind of where to go next, pay attention so much as you can to the system. If the system is in crisis, focus on bringing calm. If the system is bewildered, focus on focus. Bring the system's focus in the direction that you think will be leading to greater health and faithfulness and effectiveness. When the system is stagnant, bring challenge. Wake up the system. And when new situations arise that need a new response, bring change. Okay, so That is a crash course, an exploration of self-differentiated leadership. There are lots of fantastic materials out there by the folks that we've mentioned earlier and others. And so I encourage you to do more work with the college, as we will do in the fuller college weeks to come. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope that this is something that you can take with you in all the places where you are a leader, so that you can be a self-differentiated presence for many.